Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Accessibility and Disability Policy webinar series. Today we have with us Alex Kogan with the ARC of Texas, and she will be talking about the criminal justice system and working with people with the IDD population. And Alex, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Great. All right. So like Randy said, I'm Alex Kogan. I'm so excited that the Governor's Committee for People with Disabilities reached out to me so I can share with you some of the trainings offered by the ARC of Texas to professionals in the criminal justice field. I am a social worker and I'm currently the manager of public policy and advocacy at the ARC of Texas. The ARC of Texas, we are a statewide nonprofit. We promote, protect, and advocate for the human rights and self-determinations of Texans with IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have 28 local chapters. Those chapters are spread out throughout the state of Texas, and they provide direct services such as skill building, activities throughout the day for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You'll see a question mark in the upper right-hand corner of this screen, and I have these placed throughout the presentation. This is when I'm going to ask the audience to get involved a little bit and respond to questions. Now that you know a little bit more about me and where I work, I'd love to just get a general idea about where you all are from in Texas and what agency or organization you're with. So if you want to take a couple seconds to type that into the chat box, that would be great. Okay, we've got probation, Texas A&M, Talking Book Program, Rio Grande Legal Aid, Harris Center for MH90D, Austin, Gulf Coast, Brazos, wow, all over the place. Harris County, Johnson City. All right, wow. It's great to see so many people from all over. I am looking forward to interacting with you all throughout this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off just because for me it's personally a little bit distracting, but don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. Okay. So what the next hour or so is going to look like is we're going to discuss what the data is saying and the difference between intellectual and developmental disabilities and mental health or psychiatric disabilities. We will go over some challenges when the IDD population is involved in the criminal justice system in any capacity. And these challenges will also be sprinkled throughout the presentation. But what I'm really excited for y'all to hear about is the senior officer, James Turner, who is with the Austin Police Department and with the crisis intervention team. He is going to speak to us as well a little bit into this presentation. Next, we'll talk about what changes we can make in the community, and I'll go over a few trainings that the ARC of Texas offers, as well as what a disability response team is and how we can create one of those in your community. Finally, I'll do a quick overview of what these two trainings are. It's Pathways to Justice and Access Justice. We tailor each of these to the community and the profession. So again, it's going to be a high-level overview. I'm not going to go into the exact same content that the trainings provide, but you will walk away with some applicable information, hopefully that will help you in your day-to-day, in your agency or organization. All of these trainings will include components to identify, communicate, accommodate, and support people with IED. Finally, there will be some time for questions and answers. And one thing I want you to remember as we go through this training, keep this in mind, that if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. The reason that I have this up here is that disability looks different for everyone. Someone may have more than one disability or may have the same disability as another person, but their characteristics may vary. And I don't want us to paint a broad picture of what every single person with cerebral palsy or an intellectual disability has. Okay, so what does the data say? First of all, disability in this instance includes emotional, physical, cognitive, or sensory. But what we know is that 50 to 80% of police encounters involve people with some type of disability. They have multiple points of contact with the criminal justice system, so that can include arrest, alternatives to arrest, detention, diversion, and community supervision. And it sounds like we've got a lot of folks from all of these areas on the webinar today. All right, so people with IDD represent anywhere from 1% to 3% of the general population. However, they make up about 10% of the population in jails and prisons. They are more likely to be arrested, convicted, sentenced to prison, victimized in prison, and serve longer sentences. Individuals with IDD are frequently subject to abuse and exploitation, and may be denied alternatives to incarceration or appropriate rehabilitation programs that will address ID, intellectual disability, and behavior that will help them return safely to the community. This population is also less likely to receive probation or parole. So I just have a question to the audience. 10% is the number that we've seen in research, but what do you all think? Is this number too low? Is it too high? What are y'all, okay, I've got too low. Anyone else want to chime in about what they think about this 10% number? Yeah, more too lows. Yeah, and so we definitely think that this number is on the low side as well. We'll go into why this is, but I think most of y'all on the call can recognize that IDD, or an intellectual and developmental disability, is not always easy to identify, especially if there are no physical characteristics. And we'll go into what we can do. All right. So people with IDD, again, the data tells us that they are more likely to be violently victimized, and that includes rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and robbery. They are 4 to 10 times more likely to become victims of a crime, so abuse, neglect, and exploitation. This increased risk of victimization and abuse is usually because they are less able to escape or defend themselves. There is this common desire to please, to be accepted, to have social connections, and there are communication-related disabilities, so they might not be able to report abuse if it's happening to them. Additionally, there is a lack of education around social norms, healthy relationships, and sexual development. And so people who become victims of abuse or sexual assault may not know that what is happening to them is not right. And so they are less likely to report something if they've been told that it's a normal behavior for someone to do to them. And then they're also tend to be more dependent on supports and services. And we'll go into why that might pose a problem as well. One thing I'd also like to note is that cases are rarely investigated or prosecuted due to discrimination, prejudices that they are not worthy of protection, mistaken stereotypes that no one can be a competent witness if they have a disability. And we know that these things are not true. Half of crimes that are reported, individuals frequently don't seek victim or legal support. And sadly, these cases are rarely investigated or prosecuted with less than 1% prosecution rate. Finally, 90% of people with disability and intellectual developmental disability experience sexual assault in their lifetime. This is a really hard statistic to swallow, and a lot of those reasons, again, for this increased sexual assault is because of, again, those reasons I listed earlier: lack of education around healthy relationships, communication-related disabilities. And then, individuals who are dependent on support or caretakers or staff in their homes are worried that if the perpetrator, who is a staff member perhaps, is removed, then they will be put into a nursing home or have to leave a place that they have been familiar with their whole life. So that's also an issue. According to Health and Human Services in 2016, More than 754,000 Texans have ID, and more than 500,000 Texans have DD. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, these numbers are likely not accurate because ID and DD are not always diagnosed or identified early on. There is a stigma associated with disability still. So individuals or parents that find out that their child has a disability, they may choose to not allow that child to receive services in the school or be placed in a different classroom because of the bullying and the stigmas associated with that disability. And what that leads to, sadly, is less support and services, if any, as the child ages out of school. And you can imagine that that's going to lead to further issues down the line. We also know that there are more than 153,000 Texans on the wait list or interest list. That means that there are Texans that are not receiving services and their needs are not being met in the community, which can lead to involvement in the criminal justice system. All right, so what exactly is a developmental disability? It is a physical and or mental impairment. That means that it can be just a physical impairment, it can be just a mental impairment, or it can be both. Individuals with a developmental disability have been diagnosed prior to the age of 22, and they must have significant limitations in at least of these three areas. Self-care, receptive and expressive language, which means the ability to understand information and what others say to you or what is read. Expressive language is being able to put thoughts into words and sentences in a way that makes sense. They may have a limitation in learning, being able to move around, self-direction, living independently, and economic self-sufficiency. So taking care of their bills on their own, paying for things at the grocery store, that type of thing. Like I said, it may be a mental impairment as well. So it may or may not have a low IQ. An individual with DD, developmental disability, may or may not have a low IQ. One thing to note is that it's estimated that roughly half of people with developmental disabilities have a co-occurring intellectual disability. And on the next slide, we're going to go into what intellectual disability is. Okay, so an intellectual disability means that you have significant limitations in both adaptive behavior and intellectual functioning. So that means an IQ of 70 or 75 or below, coupled with a limitation in adaptive behavior. So what is adaptive behavior? That means that your conceptual skills, which is again, receptive and expressive language and literacy, being able to handle money, understand time, number concepts, coupled with your social skills. So how you interact with others, your ability to follow rules, obey laws, and avoid victimization, and practical skills. Activities of daily living, so eating, dressing, moving around, preparing your own meals, using the telephone, managing money, transportation. Those are all adaptive behaviors. So if you have significant limitations in both those adaptive behaviors and intellectual functioning, as well as a diagnosis before the age of 18, then you would qualify as having an intellectual disability. About 85% of people with ID will fall into the lower needs support category. And what that means is they will only be a little bit slower than the average person in learning new information and skills. And they may not be diagnosed as having an intellectual disability until they get to school. Adults with a mild ID can usually live independently, and they may not, other people may not even consider them as having a disability. All right, so psychiatric disabilities, this is mental health. You all are probably familiar with this, but this disrupts your thinking, feeling, mood, and ability to relate to others. You've probably heard of diagnoses such as major depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety. These are all psychiatric disabilities. 30 to 35% of people with an IDD also have a co-occurring psychiatric disability. This means that, well, my next question to you all, if we're looking at the general population, which is about 15% of the general population has a psychiatric disability, but 30 to 35% of people with IDD have a psychiatric disability. Why do you think there is such a discrepancy or in that number? Why are there so many more people with IDD that might have a co-occurring mental health diagnosis? So if you all want to type in the chat why you think this might be, I'd love to hear from you. Right. Looks like some people are a little shy in answering this question, but a big reason for this is the high rate of trauma that this population experiences. Additionally, seclusion, if people are staying in their homes or there aren't activities or opportunities for them to interact with the general public, that can lead to depression. And it's really that high rate of abuse and trauma that can create post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression. All right, so this is just a chart. I'm not going to go through the entire thing step by step, but it breaks down. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, I know we'll probably also be sending this out to y'all. The difference between IDD and psychiatric disabilities. As you can see, the onset for a mental health diagnosis can take place at any age. Going to be different for ID and DD. The onset will be before 18 or before age 22. An intellectual disability and a developmental disability are lifelong, so there is no cure. And a mental health diagnosis might be temporary, but medication can be helpful. So you feel free to come back to that chart at any time when you get the presentation. Okay, so we're going to jump into some challenges. Quickly, before we go over common challenges, I just want to make sure everyone recognizes that this isn't about saying people with disabilities don't commit crimes. This is really just about understanding common challenges that might prevent people with an intellectual or developmental disability from accessing justice when involved in the criminal justice system. What we know is that regardless of their role in a situation, so they might be a victim, a suspect, or a witness, barriers to justice are consistent because of outdated stereotypes, overt discrimination, and the assumptions that we make about a person's ability. So they may be denied the right to testify or not deemed credible, or be unable to assist in their own defense because recalling details might be a challenge, and competency may come into play if a lawyer discovers their client is unable to assist in their own defense. It's really important that we first assume competence and that give the person extra time to answer questions and process information. If the person is unable to understand the charges against them or have the ability to cooperate with an attorney, then a forensic evaluation should be done. They may forfeit their rights. This goes to talking about the Miranda warning, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later on. They might not be taken seriously, perhaps because of a speech impediment or slurring their words. They may be under guardianship. It is a myth that having an intellectual or developmental disability automatically means someone will have a guardian. First of all, guardianship is incredibly expensive and it requires approval of a judge. Most people with IDD do not have a guardian. Why this might be a barrier to investigations if we assume that they do? Well, what we've seen is that guardians might be the perpetrator of abuse and step in to prevent an investigation by telling an officer that the individual is incapable of communicating or providing assistance in a case. So we want to assume competence. We want to assume that the person can communicate with us. It just might not be in the traditional manner that we are used to. And then finally, they may falsely confess due to a lack of full understanding. They may be easily pressured by so-called friends and others to confess in an attempt to please or feel accepted by others. And generally, they are more likely to respond to coercion and pressure. They are suggestible to leading questions and false information, and particularly vulnerable in places that are out of their routine. So in a small room in a police station, where they're not used to having the individuals or supports around them that they're used to. And then finally, they may be unable to understand concepts of blameworthiness and culpability. So taking that into consideration is super important. All right, so I'm going to turn my video back on and introduce you to Senior Officer James Turner, who is with the Austin Police Department's Crisis Intervention Team Unit. And he is here to talk to you guys a little bit about IDD trainings and what they've meant to his department.
Hi, everybody. Like Alex introduced myself, I'm Officer James Turner with the Austin Police Department. I've been with the Austin Police Department for 13 years, and the last 8 I've been with our Crisis Intervention Team Unit. And a lot of the aspects that Alex have talked today, I could go expound more upon, but she's doing such a wonderful job. The things that I think about and the challenges that officers across the state of Texas and all public safety to help that we see are really twofold. Lack of education for our troops on the ground that are out there trying to take calls, and lack of resources. My first 5 years of my career, I worked on patrol, and I would oftentimes come into contact with people who have an intellectual or developmental disability. And at that time period, the training really wasn't there that it is today. 4 years ago, my unit was blessed enough to start meeting with the ARC of Texas, who really shined a light on our unit on the lack of training that we had. And it wasn't necessarily anything that they said, it was something that we as a unit have been thinking about for a long time, that when I get up and talk about IDD, I can only give it in one perspective to our officers and our cadets. And that was one of a law enforcement perspective in my just times that I had interacted. So we had been looking at ways to maybe increase training, but working with the ARC of Texas and our mental health authority and our IDD authority here in Travis County, we really expounded our training. So the state of Texas really only mandated for many, many years 1 hour of training on IDD for law enforcement professionals. Our department since then has, over the years, we've grown it to now we're around 5 hours of training for all our basic cadets in our department. And that's 3 hours of just identification, communication, de-escalation, talking about some of the issues that individuals with an intellectual or developmental disability encounter. And then we have the ARC of Texas actually come and speak, and they're wonderful enough to bring some self-advocates to have our cadets interact with people who have a disability. Because a lot of individuals, when they're starting police academies or fire academies or EMS academies, they may have little or no training or experience with this population. And it's one that if you have the appropriate training, you'll be able to get to these scenes, recognize the signs, recognize, hey, I think this individual might have XYZ disability. Now what do I do? Every community, it's important for y'all in your own community, for your public safety experts there, to know what to do specific for your community. In our community, we train our officers, what are the best procedures? Make those identifications, know how to de-escalate the situation, and then now what do we do? We're really blessed here in Austin, Travis County. We do have a lot of resources. I know some parts of the state, and I'm sure a lot of y'all on here know it, that there aren't a lot of resources for people who have an intellectual or developmental disability and are in crisis. So that's one of the things where, as a community, we need to be partners. That's why one of the things that we're a part of with the ARC of Texas is the Disability Rights Program, which is which is an awesome opportunity for all of us to sit around collaboratively and talk about the issues. We work with our county and district attorney's office to set up procedures. Traditionally law enforcement, we didn't know what to do with this population. And oftentimes it was either left them in the community, or you unfortunately sometimes would have to arrest them. And that's something that we as a department, we're trying our best to get that out of one of our options. It's never going to completely go away, but it's one that we can train our officers to make the best appropriate decision on these scenes. Law enforcement traditionally, they have a heart to do something. They want to help out. However, it's just, how do we problem solve? So that's one of the great things that the ARC of Texas has brought to us, is that how to work collaboratively and training and resources. So I'll get out of I'll keep talking otherwise.
Well, and we couldn't do this without the equal support of the community, of law enforcement agencies and service providers. So all working together to mitigate this problem.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
you.
much, Officer Turner. Okay, let's get back into it again. I'm going to turn my video off. Okay. So this is how we do it. We've got, as Officer Turner said, we have disability response teams and we have trainings. I want to go over the two trainings that we offer. We offer Pathways to Justice and Access Justice. Pathways to Justice is a full day, 8-hour training that is interdisciplinary. So it brings people from law enforcement, legal professionals, and victim service providers together, where they will interact the first half of the day with one another to address key barriers to justice and discuss practical solutions. This training is nationally recognized, it's field tested, and we've done it 3 times already in Travis County, which has been really well received. We also offer Access Justice, which is a profession-specific training tailored to these professions, law enforcement, lawyers, and judges, and it can range anywhere from 1.5 to 3 hours. Both trainings offer continuing education credits, and you will learn about how to identify, communicate, and accommodate and support the IDD population. So the disability response team is specific to the Pathways to Justice program. It will bring professionals from the disability and criminal justice communities together to share their expertise and what they're seeing on the ground, as well as and ultimately provide a training that uses a team approach. The disability response team exists both before and after the training, and the goal is that this is a resource, a coalition of folks that the community can go to when there are issues related to criminal justice and disability. And I'm going to move on just since we're a little short on time. I want to give you a quick overview of Access Justice, which is that profession-specific 1.5 to 3 hour training. Obviously, we don't have 1.5 hours right now. So again, recognize that this is a quick training, a quick overview, high-level overview. So with Access Justice, I like to introduce Micah, who is a self-advocate with the organization Texas Advocates. He comes along this training with me, and he talks about what he wants to see in his interactions if an officer were to come up to him. He also talks about what his friends are like, what he likes to do in his free time, and really plays a key role in this training with law enforcement. Like I said, these are the 4 core components of each training. There will always be an overlap with identifying and communicating because it's an ongoing process, but we go over these 4 sections each training. So if we're looking at identification, there are some things that you want to consider. First of all, asking someone if they have a disability is not going to give you an accurate answer most of the time. Does anyone have any idea why asking someone if they have a disability when they are approached might not be the best question? If you want to type that in the chat box, I'd love to hear what you have to say. It can be offensive, certainly. Lack of self-identification, they might become defensive. There's a stigma. Certainly, some people don't believe that they have a disability. It might anger them. Sure, they're normal. They may not say, like, this is something that is different about me. This is just who I am. Parents teach them that they just do things differently. They might be embarrassed. These are fantastic answers, and this is exactly right. So they might not know that they have a disability. They might think that they just have ADHD, and not necessarily say that they have a developmental disability or an intellectual disability. Stigma is a huge one. They have probably been taught to hide their disability throughout their life because of how other people might treat them or take advantage of them. So certainly, this is not a question that we would ever recommend an individual ask another individual. But there are other ways of discovering information by talking about education level. You can find out when that person graduated from high school. If they were in school until the age of 22, that's a good indication that there is a disability. how they communicate, whether they communicate with a word board or with accessible technology, sign language. These are all can all be used to determine whether there's something present. Perhaps they have support staff. They may call them caretaker. They may call them paid staff. Sometime I work with a self-advocate who has paid staff come in on Mondays and Wednesdays to help her prepare meals for the week. And so if you could find out if someone helps her cook or helps him cook, that might be an indicator. Where they live is also an indication. So many people live in their family's home, but they might live in intermediate care facilities or HCS homes, which means it's a group home of 4 or less individuals. So everyone they live with has a disability, but they have a lot more freedom, and they'll have staff come in, or perhaps a manager assist the home with anything that they might need. And they also may live in none of these places, right? We know that when individuals with disabilities are not receiving supports and services, they are far more likely to end up homeless. And so taking that into consideration. And then finally, what is their general life experience? Are they employed? Well, where are they employed, and what kind of job do they have? Are they working at the grocery store? Do they go to day hab throughout the day and work on building skills? Where do they hang out? All right, so if we're looking at, I'm sorry, I might be going too fast. If we're looking at possible signs of an IDD, we can kind of put these into 3 categories. How are they communicating? What is their vocabulary like? Is there a speech impairment? Do they have a hard time processing information? We always tell folks to stay away from sarcasm, abstract concepts, or figurative language, because this population tends to be very literal. So if an officer is pulling someone over for speeding and they ask the person where the fire is, if that person starts looking around for a fire, you might notice that that perhaps this person has autism or a disability that is not completely obvious. But if they're taking you at your word and taking you very literally, that should set something off in you. In terms of behaviors, they may have difficulty with everyday tasks or be easily influenced and eager to please. Again, this is going to come up throughout the presentation because this is a huge indication that there is a disability. They also may demonstrate repetitive motions or have motor impairments, such as repetitive motions such as stimming. This is a self-stimulating behavior. It can be hand flapping, rocking, spinning, repetition of words or phrases. If a person is stimming, allow them to stim as needed. It usually helps people process anxiety. So ask the person what they need to help with effective communication. Or if they can't communicate with you, try to give the person some space and then try again. They may communicate in ways that you might not expect, like cards or apps or gestures. Some people may not use words, and they may grunt to indicate that they understand you. But we shouldn't, confuse that with being under the influence, because that tends to be a common misconception. When interacting with others, again, you want to look for that over-compliance with authority figures. There is a culture of compliance within this population because many people with disabilities are accustomed to always doing what they are told and not make decisions for themselves. Compliant behavior might be repeatedly reinforced and rewarded and then becomes an expectation. So make sure when they're making a decision that it's not based on what they think that you want, but it's based on what they want. Some things that we want to consider if it's a potential victim, ask yourself these questions. Were they targeted because of their disability? Were they able to report the crime? Do they think that the treatment is normal? Again, this goes back to exploitation or sexual assault or crimes committed against a person because the perpetrator tells them that it is normal, and so they might not think that what is being done to them is inappropriate. Do they think the perpetrator is a friend? I had a client when I was interning at the Travis County Jail who repeatedly was in jail for prostitution charges because her friend, who happened to be a pimp, was quote unquote helping her and telling her that what she was doing was okay. So taking that into consideration. Are they aware of the seriousness or danger of the situation? Can they get help? So if we're looking at someone as a potential suspect, does the person actually understand their rights, or are they pretending? Again, this is a highly agreeable population and they don't want their disability to be known oftentimes, so they might just say yes and nod to questions that are asked of them. Are they saying what I want to hear? Is there a quick and easy confession? For example, a man in North Texas had a job in an auto body shop, and he would get off the bus and walk about half a mile through a strip mall to his job. One day, a series of cars were broken into, and the manager of the strip mall told the officer to go talk to this person that he sees walking through this alley all the time. Well, the officer asked if Sam had smashed windows and broken into these cars and destroyed these cars. And Sam nodded and said, yeah, that's what I do. Well, what Sam thought he was answering the police officer with was information about his job, because Sam fixes broken cars and smashed windows. And so he had easily confessed to something, or quickly confessed to something that he did not actually do. So paying attention to that. Were they used to commit the crime? A young man had some friends who took him out and said, hey, Jordan, will you watch this house? Well, Jordan thought, this is a great opportunity to get closer to my friends and to do something with them. So he agreed. What he didn't know is that he was watching the house while his quote unquote friends burglarized it. And Jordan was convicted, and he is on year 5 of probation, right, of 10 years of probation. So were they used to commit the crime? And were they present when others ran? Are they confused about who's responsible? And I know I'm going through this very quickly. I want to make sure that you all get a good taste of what these trainings look like. So I apologize for speeding up. Next, we're going to look at communication. I already spoke to you about healthy relationships and understanding what healthy sexuality, appropriate boundaries, and consent might look like, or not what it might look like, but that individuals with a disability might not be able to communicate the extent of that trauma. And again, that's because we have this, society has this assumption that due to a disability, people in this population will not have intimate relationships. However, biologically, they are no different than you and me. They have desires for romantic connections and relationships just like us. However, we're not teaching them what these should look like. They're far more likely to be taken advantage of, to be abused, or on the flip side, they may perpetrate the abuse themselves or be coerced into acts without knowing that is not appropriate, simply because it was done to them or they were not educated. So taking this into consideration when you're asking someone to communicate the extent of their trauma and whether they're aware that what was done to them was not right. All right, so some common characteristics that I want you all to recognize might not be actions might not be deceitful or deliberate or disrespectful actions. In terms of processing, they may have impaired cognitive ability, and that will impact their response to follow commands. So give the person time to fully take in information and make sure that the direction or command is understood. There may be a lack of auditory response, and this can simply be because they don't communicate through their voice box. Perhaps they use sign language, gestures, or assistive technology. So if they're not responding to verbal instruction, there might be a reason why, and that it's not just them being disrespectful or deliberately ignoring you to make you frustrated. Physically, they may run or move away when approached. Consider why the person is running. Maybe it's fear, and you can decrease that fear by making a personal connection with them, asking what they need to feel safe. They may run away when approached because they're running to their safe space, which is something we know has happened, and that has been taught to them by their staff or their caregiver, their parent, whoever it is, when someone might feel triggered. It's very common for this population to avoid eye contact, and they may appear under the influence or stim. We work with an individual who is in DC, and she's in a motorized chair because she has cerebral palsy. Unfortunately, one day she was hit by a car while crossing the street, and the officer assumed that she was driving under the influence because she has a speech impairment. So it's really important to consider that people communicate differently, their voice boxes are different, and to not just make these assumptions about someone based on these characteristics. They may, like I said, might be honest to the point of rudeness or have difficulty speaking at the correct volume. We work with another self-advocate who was in the car one day with a staff at the Arc of Texas. The staff member, she had a really big pimple on her face that she'd tried to cover up with makeup. The person sitting next to her made it a point to let her know that she had a really big pimple on her face. So she wasn't wrong, but she was just being very honest, which, you know, we may think she was being rude, but in her mind, she was just letting her know that this is something that she had observed. So keeping that in mind. All right, so we're going to talk about accommodation. We know that there are a lot of places where disability can be missed. It isn't just on one group of professionals to catch it. So it's important that everyone screens everyone at every stop. And this is going to obviously look different depending on your profession, but you can see that there are a lot of opportunities to catch a disability. And we want to make sure that law enforcement knows, that lawyers know, and judges know that it's working together that will increase the chances of catching a disability early on. So this population has the same access to justice as their similarly situated peers without disabilities. All right, I am going to show you this one video of Micah. He just wants to let you know what he would appreciate if he were to interact with a police officer.
I want police officers to know that adults with IDD are adults. I want police officers to respect and talk as he talking to me, to be calm and nice, use pictures, explain things, and speak slowly. Sometimes the police officer make me nervous. If I get upset, I like to call my family and explain and talk to things with them.
All right, so that's just a little taste of what Micah likes to share in the trainings. He pops up throughout them, and we definitely know that it is a huge added bonus to be able to hear directly from people with disabilities. All right, so a quick snapshot of what a first contact might look like. If you believe that there might be a disability, and you can certainly do this even if you don't think there's a disability, you want to make sure that you're slowing down if you can. We know that it's not always an available option for officers responding to a call, but it should be the first tactical consideration so we don't trigger the person further, and so we can ensure that the situation is not escalated needlessly. So always try and state your intent and show a picture ID. This will help ground the person in understanding a little bit more about what's going on. Address that individual first, and if you're unable to get the information that you need from them, and then I would suggest talking to a staff or a guardian or someone else who might know how best to communicate with this individual, what can calm them down. Use simple language that's short and to the point. We want to ask closed and open-ended questions. Any idea why we might want to ask both types of questions? I know I don't have a question mark on the upper right-hand corner, but I'm curious what you all think. Is there a reason that we would ask closed and open-ended questions? All right, no worries. So determine the ability to process, definitely, yeah. Making sure the individual understands and that their responses are consistent. Y'all know this already, exactly. These are fantastic answers. It's also another way to engage in understanding. Totally. So closed-ended questions are yes or no answers, right? And because this tends to be a very agreeable population, they are far more likely to just say yes to things, especially if they think that that's what you want to hear. So you might not get accurate information if you're only asking closed-ended questions. An open-ended question does allow you to confirm that answer. It gives you more information. It gauges their comprehension of the situation and what's going on. Great. And so give them extra space and time so they can answer those open-ended questions, excuse me. Obviously, patience is a huge one. I think regardless of what profession we are in, we could always likely be more patient. Reducing distractions. So if you are a lawyer or a judge with a client, if the courtroom is really full and there's a lot of talking going on, waiting for that room to clear is going to be beneficial to that person and communicating with them. Always check for understanding. Ask if they can tell you in their own words what is going on or what they think is happening. Consider specific needs like assistive technology or fidgets if they need to focus on something for them to answer your questions. Those little fidgets or fidget spinners we've seen have been helpful. Predict when events will happen. Like I said earlier, abstract concepts can be difficult, and that includes time. So if something is going to happen in the afternoon, perhaps you can say that it's going to happen after lunchtime or before dinner. Tying it to concrete events is going to be helpful. And then make sure that you're sharing information with others. So if you do have to make an arrest and you believe that there is an intellectual or developmental disability, it's really important that you're either talking to your supervisors about it or letting jailers know so they can start a process for that individual in a new environment that's going to take their disability into consideration. So some things that we might want to avoid. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with each of these because this isn't a full training, but here are some suggestions. We don't want to suggest answers or complete thoughts. We know this because it is a highly suggestible population. So that's not going to help us get the most accurate information. We don't want to infantilize an individual. Micah let us know he's an adult and he wants to be treated like an adult. So that means keeping your tone. Perhaps you will want to change your vocabulary. A 4th or 5th grade level of vocabulary is about the average that this population understands. So change your vocabulary, keep your tone. Approaching from behind, I wouldn't want to be approached from behind either, but it might be especially triggering for this population. So we want to avoid that and get on their level if you can safely do that. So if they're on the ground, standing over them might be a more triggering position for them. We don't want to label a normal behavior as a problem or ask back-to-back questions because that back-to-back questioning is not going to give them enough time to process. And again, we don't want to assume complete understanding, but we want to continue to check for understanding. Finally, using pronouns and abstract concepts is going to be something we want to avoid as well. Pronouns such as she, her, it, they, them Those are not easy to identify if there are 5 women in a room or 3 men that you are trying to decipher between. So use names, use colors of clothing, concrete characteristics. That'll be most helpful. All right. So support, what can we do? This is going to be specific for law enforcement officers and legal professionals. I know that this isn't mandated to officers across the state of Texas, but the Austin Police Department received approval from their city legal department, and they instruct their officers to read through the traditional version of the Miranda warning and then break it down in a modified version. Just as an officer wouldn't read the Miranda warning in English to a Spanish-only speaking individual and expect it to hold up in court, the same logic applies here. This can get tricky if an officer doesn't believe that there is a disability, so we suggest just breaking this modified version down for everyone, whether they have a disability or you're not sure if they have a disability. Essentially, a key part of this is you'll see at the end, please tell me in your own words what I told you. That's going to be really helpful for you to understand if they are aware of what's happening to them. And it might also give you another indication of whether a disability is present if they can answer those for you. All right, so continued contact. Like I said, it's great if you can contact a supervisor for advice. Everyone has a LIDA or a local intellectual and developmental disability authority, and they are great resources. If this person has been receiving services with them, they will be able to provide you with information about what that person might need, what might calm them down, the best way to communicate with them. A challenge, of course, is that a lot of folks with disabilities who get swept up into the criminal justice system have not been receiving supports and services throughout their life. So they might not have a case with their local intellectual and developmental disability authority. And so that's an opportunity for them to get involved and to do assessments to see how to support this person while they are incarcerated. Of course, using calming and reassuring language is always ideal. And if you can avoid handcuffs or have a staff person with that individual accompanying them to jail if they do need to be taken in, and allowing for comfort items, these will all help the individual transition from a place that they are used to being in, whether it's their home or a day hab, into a new location, which we know can be triggering. All right, so I'm just going to wrap up and leave you with a few points to consider. Disability, it's going to look different for everyone. Like I said in the very beginning of this presentation, it's common for an individual to have more than one disability, and it's going to manifest itself differently for everyone. So to have an open mind and really slow down when we think that there might be a disability present, so we can gather more information and best help this person. Finally, everyone communicates differently. I communicate differently than my colleagues. I work better when I can see when words are put into pictures and information is provided to me through a PowerPoint than a Word document. So everyone communicates differently and is helped in different ways. So think of different ways that you can provide information or explain concepts to people and give them a little bit of extra time to process that. All right, y'all, that is the end of the presentation. I know this was very quick. I wanted to make sure that you walked away with some concrete action steps that you can take and that you are aware of the resources available to you throughout the state, whether that is bringing trainings to your community or starting a disability response team. We are here to support you at the ARC of Texas, making sure that people in your department or your agency are receiving the most updated information on this population. I am open to questions, and if I can't answer any of your questions, I will certainly take them back to my team and we will provide answers to them or to you in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much. And Officer Turner, thank you for joining us today too. What great information. We did have someone that made a statement that I wanted to share, and maybe you can speak to that, Alex. That many people don't, the statement that many people don't have guardianship because it is expensive and requires a judge's order is misleading. I think it is important to note that guardianship is very restrictive and not appropriate for many people with IDD who are not necessarily incapacitated and substantially unable to provide food, clothing, or shelter for themselves, care for own physical health, or manage their own lives or their own affairs. Many people with IDD can be supported with informal assistance and guidance and do not need a guardian, including supportive decision-making agreements. So can you speak to that?
I mean, I would completely agree with that. Guardianship is not always appropriate. And I couldn't have said that better myself. We certainly supported decision-making, and we would encourage people to look at that over guardianship any day, because many people don't need guardians, not just because it's expensive, but they simply don't need them in order to live the independent lives that they want to live, just like we want to live independently. So I couldn't agree more with that statement. Thank you to whoever typed that out and sent it to us. It's certainly true.
All right, we do have a couple of questions. Can it be possible for an individual to fake his or her actions to make police officers believe he or she is disabled?
Anything is possible. An individual with an intellectual or developmental disability will or should have some sort of paper trail, in a sense, whether they were receiving special education classes in school, or even interviewing family members and asking them about what that person was like growing up can be a way to determine whether they're faking it or not, or just other people in their life. However, I would not say, I personally have never met anyone that was faking a disability. Doing that would, I imagine, would be challenging, and it would also probably come out sooner or later that this individual is not being truthful.
Yeah.
Throughout the criminal justice process.
Can family members get service? I'm sorry, we have at least three more questions. Let me start at the top. Does APD use a modified version of the Miranda warning in Spanish? Can Officer Turner, is he still around to answer that?
I will send him this question and
okay.
he will respond.
Where can a family get services?
So that is going to depend on wherever you are located, but contacting your local independent or local intellectual and developmental disability authority, or your LIDA. There are, I believe, 31 LIDAs throughout the state of Texas. Some represent more counties than others. So that would be the best place to start.
I'll make a note after the session. We can send out that those training material, just the overview that you did. And I will get a link for all the LIDAs, and I can include that in a follow-up email.
That's great.
Make a note for that. And then how do you identify individuals with IDD in the jail?
So that is going to vary from county jail to county jail. There is an assessment form that all jailers are required to perform on individuals that come into their jail. That form can be modified and questions can be added to it at the discretion of the county. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of questions on that form that will indicate a disability. I believe there is one about learning and whether the individual was ever told that they had learning difficulties or challenges. So that isn't the best answer, because I don't think that that fully gets at properly identifying someone. However, at the ARC of Texas, we actually sit on an IDD task force committee through the Texas Commission on jail standards. And we are currently working on how to properly identify someone when they go into a county jail, because we know that there are a lot of folks that are being missed. So we are currently working on that because we know it's an issue that jailers and administrative staff come into experience on a regular basis.
I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. Oh wait, there's one over the chat box though. How long should it take to get a youth link to LIDA?
I'm sorry, how long should it
take to get a youth, a younger person linked to the LIDA, the LIDA? And how long should we wait to get help from an advocacy group like yours?
Depends what kind of help you're looking for. And the LIDA time is going to vary from one to another. I know that there is an assessment process that takes place. And sadly, I don't have a better answer for you than that because each county is going to be different and caseloads are going to be different. But I would just encourage family members to start that process as soon as possible. And if the individual is still in school, having that conversation with the proper administrative or staff at the school to get that person tested and help them transition from school into the community through the help of a LIDA.
I was thinking that would be a good part of their IEP process, the individual education program plan and their transition plan is transitioning to making sure they get those services as they transition into the community too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I definitely encourage getting involved with a LIDA as soon as possible. What we have seen is that folks will turn 23 and they may have received support, special education support in the school, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the LIDA is aware of the individual. And so making sure that those two are connected.
Well, I see no other questions. I just want to remind everyone that Alex and her organization are here to provide training for your local law enforcement community. So this is a great resource to tap into. They can travel and come to you. So they have different kinds of trainings that you got a little taste of. So they're here for you. Just don't forget that. Otherwise, I see no more questions. So I would like to thank you again, Alex, for joining us. Please thank Officer Turner. I would like to thank Texas Closed Captioning for the captioning services. And with that, we will close for today. Have a great day. Bye-bye.